So you all did a great job of really answering this question: how will future flooding impact the point? How will it affect you as stakeholders in the point? We're going to be sharing some of the details, more specifically of different kinds of impacts, many of which reflect the things that you said. We're also going to be relating those back to what we understand some of the community priorities are. And there probably are other community priorities, and we hope to learn about those from you and incorporate that in the work going forward. So one of the key priorities of the neighborhood is safe, affordable, and healthy housing. It is one of the more affordable neighborhoods in the city. There's been a lot of progress to date with renovation and modernization of affordable housing, with the city working with partners like North Shore CDC and others, Salem Housing Authority. There's been new affordable housing being developed. And also there are annual partnerships and funding to support renters and owners in improving the affordability of housing. Next, please. But how are residents impacted potentially by flooding? So one key thing to remember is that because we have 83% again renters in the neighborhood, 83% of units rather being rental units, that most renters lack flood insurance and are also ineligible for certain kinds of federal disaster assistance. And so you're kind of left to deal with it on your own. And maybe you have a good landlord that treats you well and helps resolve issues, but maybe you don't. But how can people be impacted as residents? There's health and safety hazards. It's obviously very stressful to have to deal with flooding in your home. There may be costs to relocate temporarily while work is being done, while there's damage to your house. You may be left with decreased quality of housing after a flood, including the mold and things we talked about before. Personal vehicles, people rely on their vehicles for work. Your vehicle, if it's in the street, may be flooded, may be damaged. And there's also, other impacts like loss of power, heating, cooling, things that you rely to make a house safe. So that goal of a safe, affordable housing is very, very much a risk for this neighborhood. And of course, for the property owners, there's a lot of costs. There's cleanup costs to deal with the things like mold remediation. There's the cost of repairing damage to the structure, to the utilities. And it also over time can lower property value or raise insurance costs. And one of the things I wanted to mention was just the basements, right? Basements are like the first place that's going to flood is the basement. So keep an eye, what is in your basement? How important is what's in there? And can you do something to reduce the risk that's down there? So this map shows the residential housing and the impact on residential buildings rather. There are about 100 residential buildings, including 27 affordable housing and public housing buildings that will be impacted. So a third of the housing impacted is affordable housing, and that's of concern. Next, please. Oh.
Maria.
Diane, sorry, Maria.
I'm sorry, having some difficulties. Bueno, básicamente lo que Nasser estaba mencionando es que las viviendas han tenido una serie de progreso. Han habido renovaciones y modernizaciones de las viviendas, nuevos planes para viviendas asequibles, colaboración y financiación para apoyar a los inquilinos y propietarios. Y queremos mostrar la comparación, digamos, lo que vive un residente y lo que vive el dueño de estas propiedades cuando ocurren este tipo de eventos como inundaciones o calor extremo. Este mapa está indicando en el amarillo más oscuro la vivienda pública y asequible, y en el amarillo más claro la residencia en general del punto. 100 edificios de residencias y de usos mixtos se ven se ven afectados durante este evento, y 24 públicos y asequibles. That would be all. Next.
27.
Yes.
Muchos.
Yes.
Oh, pero gracias. Next, please. So we know another priority for the neighborhood that's been expressed through the vision and action plans, et cetera, is jobs, education, career development, and small business support. We saw in the data, higher unemployment in the neighborhood, lower income. So we know this is important. And some progress has been made through the planning and implementation of those plans. Median income has increased about 20% from 2013 to 2019. We recognize the pandemic happened after that. Unemployment has decreased by about 58%, which is a lot, but it's still not good. And we know there are annual partnerships and funding with different partnerships and the city investing money and others investing money in helping small businesses. So how does this impact workers and customers and employers? Well, for example, workers may lose income, right? Or they may lose their job if their place where they work is impacted, if they can't get to work, for example. Customers may lose access to goods and services that could be temporary, right, during the storm, or it could be for a longer term. Because we know that 1 out of 4 businesses that experiences a disaster does not reopen afterwards, right? So it's important. I know that the community cares about the local businesses, and so it's important that we have concern for them. And for the employers, of course, there's potential for lost revenue, for costs, damage, dealing with all those things, and even those things like lower property values and higher insurance costs. In terms of the places where people work and the businesses that are in this area that we know is going to be more at risk in the future, but is already at risk today. We have a lot of different employers along Congress and Leavitt Street, as well as at Shetland Park.
Bueno, básicamente lo que se acaba de hablar en las diapositivas anteriores es que hay definitivamente un impacto hacia el empleo, la educación, el desarrollo profesional y el apoyo a pequeñas empresas del punto. Ha habido un progreso importante, el ingreso medio aumentó un 20% desde el 2013 al 2019, el desempleo disminuyó un 58%. Y han habido colaboraciones y financiación para apoyar a las pequeñas empresas del punto. Esto hizo que pues, se plantearan los 3 distintos escenarios para un trabajador o empleado, clientes y el empleador, lo que significa para cada uno de ellos este tipo de eventos y cómo los pueda afectar de una u otra manera. Y en este mapa podemos ver claramente edificios comerciales, edificios de industria, de uso mixto y de non-profits, dentro de los cuales está el Palmer Cove, el Club de Yates, el Punto Urban, el Museo de Arte Urbano, entre otros negocios y puntos importantes digamos que el sistema económico del punto. Yeah. That's all.
So when we look at the big picture of just buildings and land uses, what is impacted? So it's primarily residential and mixed use as part of that. Buildings are impacted. There are also commercial properties and industrial properties that are impacted, and also nonprofit organization buildings.
Este mapa muestra digamos que todos los edificios y sus usos de suelo, y muestra a la izquierda abajo muestra la cantidad de edificios que están siendo impactados por uso de suelo. Eso es básicamente lo que está mostrando este mapa. Next.
So another priority that we've seen in various different places that the community has expressed is a priority of creating parks and sidewalks and streets that are welcoming, clean, and safe. And a lot has been done in the neighborhood in terms of improving parks. All the recreational parks in the neighborhood have been improved at some point in the past 10 years. PBD Street Park is kind of the last one to be coming back. There are improved sidewalks and streets and bike routes and new trees that have been planted, the Harbor Walk, and also increased street cleaning. People were concerned about trash in the neighborhood and leaves, and there's been improvements in street cleaning to help improve the neighborhood quality.
Han habido una serie de progresos y proyectos para mejoras de parques públicos, arborización, mejora de calles, de rutas para bicicletas, aceras, entre otros elementos, y aumento de la limpieza de las calles. Acá simplemente queremos reconocer el distinto progreso que se ha realizado en el punto. Next.
So impacts to these recreation areas and the open space areas can impact people who use those places, the users, the visitors, people in the neighborhood. The danger of being exposed to flooding at a site, you could lose access or have a decreased quality of recreational facilities going forward. And for the city also has to deal with the damage that can happen to these parks and the cleanup costs of dealing with storm damage to these facilities. And it's already happened, right? When Palmer Cove flooded, right? There was impacts to the park.
Acá se están reconociendo los espacios abiertos y los lugares de recreación del punto y toda la serie de impactos que tienen usuarios y visitantes, y digamos lo que también impacta a la ciudad de Salem como agencia de la ciudad que trata de manejar todos estos espacios. Y como acaba de decir Nasser, se pudo ver claramente en la inundación de Palmer Cove. Next.
So this map again shows how do these areas that we know are going to be flooding more frequently and that are at risk today, what open spaces and recreational assets are in those areas. And what we see is that all recreational parks in the neighborhood and all the harbor walks are in this area of impact.
Ver todos los caminos del puerto que pueden ser impactados en el futuro, las distintas rutas de bicicleta, parques, gimnasios y digamos lugares importantes para la comunidad en temas de recreación y digamos que de actividades al aire libre. Next.
So some people mentioned in the Mentimeter, of course, concern about access to places that they go. So we know that impacts to the transportation system, to mobility and evacuation routes can affect people. Actually, the number one cause of drownings during floods is when people try to drive through a flooded road. They try to drive through water. So there's a saying that says, turn around, don't drown. So that's one piece of advice to leave you with from this meeting. Don't try to do that. But you can also lose access to your job, to your home, to childcare, to schools. And there's also other impacts from the damage to roads that the city of Salem has to deal with, the cleanup, not being able to get medical and emergency response services to an area because of flooding in the streets. And then afterwards cleaning up and then rebuilding damaged infrastructure.
Acá comenzamos a hablar sobre la movilidad y las rutas de evacuación y dividimos acá entre usuarios y lo que es la ciudad de Salem como otra vez como la agencia pública que se encarga de manejar todos estos bienes, y vemos distintos riesgos en tema en las vías, la respuesta médica y de emergencias, las evacuaciones, el acceso a los empleos, los hogares, el cuidado de los niños, ocurre mucho tráfico y congestión, hay pérdida de ingresos. Digamos que eso es como una serie de parámetros que queremos considerar. Y la ciudad de Salem, digamos que se ve expuesta a riesgos de seguridad, a poder suplir a la comunidad con respuesta médica y de emergencia. Hay costos de limpieza y de remoción de escombros y muchos daños en toda la infraestructura de la ciudad. Next.
So in terms of, again, the flooding map here showing what transportation, what mobility systems will be impacted by flooding more in the future and are at risk today. It includes things like impacting all of the bus routes through the neighborhood, which are very important for people to get to work and get around. Also impacts to Lafayette Street, you can see there near Derby, and also Congress Street in a couple of different places, key roads through the neighborhood, and also access to the Saltonstall School. You can see there, Salem Street is impacted as well. So these are all concerns for people.
El sistema, podemos ver claramente en el mapa como el sistema de buses se ve impactado por la inundación, como calles de gran importancia para la zona, como lo son Congress Street y Lafayette, también se ven impactados por estas inundaciones. Y básicamente como todo el sistema de movilidad podría verse afectado por estas vías principales verse inundadas en el futuro. Next.
Another priority that we've seen come out through the neighborhood expressing its interest here includes the need for public, community, and social support services that are provided in Spanish to residents of all ages and abilities. And some progress on this. There's a lot of really active community organizations, which helps to build a strong social capital, strong social network, which is important for resilience. And there's a lot of different services that are provided by these organizations in the City of Salem in partnership. Some of the community assets, community facilities, and also critical assets like for emergencies, the impact of these assets can result in the loss or the disruption or the degradation in those services, right? And they include things like school and daycare. And also for utilities and emergency response, we have an important power electrical facility that is in the flood area. And so we worry about loss of power. This can also happen at your building. You know, if something gets wet, you lose power. And then there's also potential for damage to community and cultural facilities.
En esta sección estamos hablando de todos los servicios de apoyo comunitario y social proporcionados en español a todos los residentes de todas las edades del punto. Como hay un progreso en coordinar todos los asuntos latinos de la ciudad, como hay una colaboración de financiamiento de servicios como vivienda, inmigración, educación, para personas mayores, para personas con discapacidades, alimentos, residentes sin hogar, entre otros. Y en esta diapositiva podemos ver dos factores importantes que son los servicios comunales, como es la pérdida, disrupción o degradación de servicios, que esos son las escuelas, las guarderías, los centros comunales que tienen un valor muy importante para la comunidad y hace parte de su estructura social y digamos que lo que hace muy fuerte a esta zona de la ciudad. Por otro lado, tenemos los servicios públicos y la atención a emergencia que también se ven amenazados por la inundación. En la zona, ahorita vamos a ver en el mapa, hay una subestación de electricidad y al verse afectada por la inundación puede haber una pérdida de potencia en este servicio eléctrico y eso puede afectar las necesidades básicas del punto. Hay daños de bienes y programas comunales y culturales que otra vez hacen parte fundamental de la infraestructura. Next.
So this is again, a map showing the flooding area and the impacted assets that we were talking about here. Importantly, the fire station, which is kind of actually hidden behind this label here, but the fire station that serves the point, that is in the flood area, right? And its the route that it would take to get to the neighborhood, that is Lafayette, that is flooded, right? So that's of concern for the neighborhood. And of course, the flooding of the electrical facility that's there, but also importantly, Espacio. Espacio is the new community center that was built by North Shore CDC. Espacio is in the flood area, and it provides a lot of different services to the community, and so that's of course a concern, as well as a childcare facility.
En este mapa podemos ver claramente cómo todos estos edificios se ven afectados por la inundación. Como lo pueden ver arriba, el cuadrado café es la subestación de electricidad y pues se vería afectado por la inundación nuevamente. Y la Fayette, que es la calle que está conectando hacia el norte, también estaría impactada por la inundación, que conecta adicionalmente con centros de salud, la estación de bomberos, entre otros. También, y muy importante para el proyecto considerar, es el impacto en Espacio, que es esta organización que es clave para servicios comunitarios del punto. Entonces, para tener en cuenta esto en el momento de pensar en los impactos. Next.
So the final priority that we've identified, again, there are probably more, and we hope to learn from you about what those are through the interviews and through surveys, et cetera, and through this meeting. It is a community that is proud of its history and invested in its future. And we see this, a lot of progress towards this. We see that this is something that people actually already value about the neighborhood, but it's something that people want to maintain. There's been implementation, really good implementation of the neighborhood plans. There's still more to do. The Point Historic District was created to capture the history of the neighborhood, including as an immigrant neighborhood. And there are also a lot of new community and cultural spaces, the murals, the Espacio, Punto Art Museum. These are all and youth leadership development programs. So we know that the community has been invested in making this a priority happen.
Esto es entender un poco que es una comunidad que está orgullosa de su historia y que quiere invertir en su futuro. Y hay un progreso importante para considerar, que es la implementación de planes en los vecindarios, este proyecto de El Punto como distrito histórico, nuevos espacios culturales y comunales como lo es Espacio o Punto Urban, el Museo Urbano, Fiesta en la Calle y programas de formación de líderes y desarrollo de los jóvenes. Next.
So I think we've shown here that the climate change threatens to set back progress that has already been made in the point, and that it will also make long-term improvements more difficult if action is not taken very soon. So that is what's driving this project. Next, please. But again, focusing also on the positive side here is that climate change adaptation, which is basically us changing things about the way we behave or the way our environment is structured, and how we work together. Investment in climate change adaptation can help support these priorities. So again, we mentioned there are opportunities for investment in the point for climate change adaptation, that these investments will focus on protecting and enhancing community priorities as we understand them now and as that evolves based on what we learn from the community. And also that adaptation, climate change adaptation improvements can also provide multiple benefits and improve daily quality of life. So it's not just something that we spend money on that only helps us in a very extreme event today, but actually can actually help us make the neighborhood a better place to live.